Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, we've entered day 220 plus, day 221 maybe, of the ongoing Russia-Ukrainian war. And we are starting to hear reports coming out of certain media outlets. In this specific instance, it's coming out of Newsmax that is saying that initial reports that the Russians are preparing for the possible use of nuclear weapons and have started the movement and processes of which would be needed to deploy said tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons. It's reported that the Russians have moved assets from the 12th Main Directorate of the Ministry of Defense. This unit is designed in the storage and upkeep of nuclear weapons. And it's reported that there has been some activity via train networks of the movement of some systems towards Ukraine. Very interesting. What's causing this? Well, the situation on the ground right now for the Russians, needless to say, has become precarious. We are receiving reports now on the western bank of the Dnieper River that Ukrainian forces have achieved a breakthrough in the northeastern quadrant of the western bank of the Dnieper River. It's reported that Ukrainian armored units have broke through Russian lines in this area here, you can see on my map, and are steadily advancing in a southwesterly direction along the Dnieper River. This is significant. If the Ukrainians are able to defeat Russian forces on this western bank and drive Russian forces out, or get the Russian forces in this area to capitulate and surrender, which would be even a bigger disaster, we could see the actions of the Kremlin start to take a very, very sinister turn in terms of how this conflict could be conducted. We've already seen significant setbacks in the northeast, east and southeast of Kharkov, and those operations continue. The Ukrainians have established bridgeheads east of the Oskil River and continue operations against Russian forces. We continue to see the Russians mobilize. Now, this mobilization is not probably going to bear fruit for Russian forces until, my guesstimate, would be around January, until you would see this mobilization really start to help the Russian forces. And from my understanding, yes, the Russians will use reserves within the confines of this conflict, but more specifically, these reserves are designed where Russia can then move really its entire army to help support the current war that is taking place. The reserves, the Russian reserves that are being called up, a large component of those reserves are going to be designed to backfill Russian forces that will be deployed, active duty Russian forces that will be deployed against Ukraine. Now, obviously, eventually, you will also see reserve forces coming into play directly against Ukrainian forces as well. But look, the Russians went into this probably thinking it was going to get a much different result than what is happening right now. And because of the direct intervention by the United States, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, supplying weapons, and most importantly, intelligence, this has become very, very difficult for Russian forces. This continuing campaign. But as we speak, as the Russian forces continue to withdraw and get pushed back in some of these areas, the force density of Russian forces deployed in these areas are going to start to concentrate. And it's going to become more and more difficult for Ukrainian forces to make headway. But right now we have to watch very closely what's happening on the western bank of the Dnieper River, this area here. Is this going to be the catalyst for a possible Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons? How would that manifest itself? Well, I believe that if the Russians decide to use tactical nuclear weapons, they will first stage an exercise with the use of nuclear weapons in some sort of training exercise. Probably someplace else in the Russian Federation, they may conduct an above-ground use of tactical nuclear weapons. At the same time, they will forward deploy tactical nuclear weapons for possible use against Ukrainian forces. Now, we're not there yet, and Russia has not detonated a nuclear weapon in testing. But that could very well happen. I think we're getting to that point. At the same time, the possibility that Russia could deploy against NATO forces directly, either in Poland or Romania, is still omnipresent. It could happen. We could also see an expansion of Russian attacks in western Ukraine. We have still not seen the full weight and power of the Russian military come to bear against Kiev as of yet. And at this point, we don't really have an answer for that, given what's happening on the ground. Has there been some sort of initial agreement that was reached between Kiev and its NATO partners and the Russian Federation, where the war would not be expanded into Kiev proper, meaning we would not see the large-scale use of air-to-ground attack systems against the city of Kiev? Was there some sort of agreement made that the Russians would not target the power infrastructure of Ukraine? Difficult to say. Could the Ukrainians launch an operation into Russia proper in the direction of Belgorod, Kursk, or Bryansk, or even Belarus? The capability's there. The Ukrainians, when they drove the Russians out of Kharkov, this offensive that took place east of Kharkov, what was stopping them from crossing the Russian-Ukrainian border in the direction of Belgorod? Was there some sort of agreement established? Difficult to say at this point. But there's things happening within the confines of this conflict that are just strange to me. They don't make a lot of sense. And I'm not certain what to say to that or how to understand some of the things that we are seeing within this conflict. Just again, very, very strange. And I think some of you would agree, as I've seen it in the comment section. Even supporters of the Russian side kind of say the same thing, as do the Ukrainian side as well. There seems to be some sort of self-imposed restraints in this conflict that are odd, to say the least. But that's where we sit today. But again, there are reports that the Russians are starting to move some weapon systems within the nuclear realm. Now, the United States says they're not seeing any indications of a possible Russian nuclear response. In all probability, it would be very difficult for the United States to have perfect optics in regards to a possible Russian nuclear use. It's not like they were watching the pre-invasion buildup. The Russians would have the ability to move nuclear weapon systems around, again, probably in a manner that would be difficult for Western forces to track. But what happens if the Russians attack a NATO target in Poland or Romania? What happens then? Is the mobilization that we're seeing right now in Russia in preparation for an expansion of the war? Difficult to say at this point. But we could see, by going into January, February, March of next year, a Russian ground forces that could number close to 1 million personnel. And well over 1 million personnel if you take into account the Russian National Guard. So we'll have to see what happens. Watching it very, very closely. Very disturbing indications of a possible escalation. We've been talking about this for a while now. But it is definitely not cooling down. Things are moving in a direction where the conflict could spread. It is not going the opposite direction. It is going towards something bigger rather than smaller. But as always, we'll continue to cover, report, watch very, very closely, and bring you more content. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, have a good day.